guest today. So my name is Hector Escalante. If you don't know me, I'm the University Ombuds for all three campuses for Stockton, Sacramento, and San Francisco. I'm also a proud alumnus of the University of the Pacific. You can see my tagger right here, whispers in my ear, reminds me I'm an alum. So I'm really excited and delighted to host this conversation. It's such an important conversation right now. It always has been. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been important. It seems especially important right now, given the state of our world, the state of our nation, the state of our communities. Here at the University of Pacific, Stockton, and the other cities where our alumni are, it's such an important topic, and we have some really cool guests here to help us with that conversation. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot. We're going to have a few questions, and hopefully we have some time at the end for questions from the participants. So thank you, Lyndon Huling and Michael Orozco, for being here with us. Lyndon is from UC Davis and Michael is from Netflix. So instead of reading your bio, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a little bit about your career, what brought you to the work you're doing now, and just a little bit of background. So Michael, do you mind starting us off with that question?
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I'm excited to be here, so thank you. Also, a quick shout out to Marcia. Thanks for getting me here as well. And Sal, I see Sal on the line. And so I am a recruiter. I work at Netflix. I've been at Netflix for the last 3 years. And I was going to backtrack my career and how I got into recruiting. But I felt that I actually wanted to start at the source. So I've been in recruiting for the last professional 5 years, now professional 6 years. And so I was actually on a networking call with a manager at LinkedIn on Monday, just chatting. And she asked me, she was like, hey, like, how did you get into recruiting? And I actually got into recruiting because of the CCI at UOP. So I also just want to make sure I gave the CCI a quick shout out. So Center for Community Involvement. When I was a junior at UOP, I graduated in 2015. When I was a junior, the CCI had an alternative spring break trip. And so a group of students essentially planned for a year to go to Mexico. We went to Puebla, Mexico, and I formed a great relationship with Aaron Rausch, who was the director of the CCI at the time. And Aaron actually tapped me to join the leadership team my senior year, just based off of us working together my junior year. And so because of Aaron Rausch, I actually joined the CCI my senior year as the volunteer recruiter and educator. And so that's where I actually got my first kind of experience of what recruiting was actually like, because my job for the CCI was actually to recruit volunteers at UOP for our volunteer programs at the CCI. And so that was my role as a senior in college. And when I was graduating, I knew that I wanted to do something sales and recruiting because of the CCI. And so when I was graduating college, I actually only applied to sales and recruiting companies. And so that's how I landed my first gig right after college. 2 weeks later, I had my first job and I moved to San Francisco. I'm from Stockton, born and raised. And so I moved to San Francisco right after I graduated in 2015. I worked at a small company called Tech Systems. It's a very small recruiting agency. It's typically how folks get involved in recruiting from the get-go. Either you join an agency or you join a big in-house company and you're a recruiting coordinator. And so I was at an agency for about 10 months. Thankfully only for 10 months. And then I got reached out to on LinkedIn by a recruiter at Uber headquarters. And that's where I really found the idea of how recruiters could actually change folks' lives by getting them new jobs. And so I was at agency for 10 months and I went to Uber headquarters for about 1.5 years. My last 3 months there, I was on a new team, which was our diversity recruiting team. And that was 3.5 years ago. And I joined that new team on my last couple of months at Uber, which got me really involved with diversity recruiting. And then from there, I actually was recruited to Netflix. And since joining Netflix, we didn't have a diversity team 3 years ago when I started. And so I brought in my learnings and just a passion from Uber into Netflix, which is where I've been for the last 3 years.
Cool. I'm sure people always ask you if you get free Netflix, so I won't ask you that. But thanks for sharing, Michael. I appreciate that. Lyndon, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Before I do, I definitely want to stake claim to that free Netflix if it's up for grabs. I thought that's how I was going to be rewarded for my time here. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lyndon Huling, and I currently serve as the manager of our Leadership Recruitment and Diversity Services Office in Human Resources here at UC Davis. Long story short, in terms of the role, I oversee our executive level recruitments for both the Davis campus as well as UC Davis Health. So here at UC Davis, we have a medical center, hospital, school of medicine, school of nursing, and then certainly at UC Davis, we have the undergraduate campus, as well as the School of Veterinary Medicine and lots of other programs. So a lot of really unique opportunities to focus on recruiting diverse top talent to UC Davis. I also lead our diversity initiatives across human resources. So we focus a lot on community partnerships, workplace climate topics, employee labor relation issues. So really the full gamut in terms of supporting staff and ensuring that they're having rewarding and successful career here at UC Davis. In terms of my career and what got me here, out of high school, I actually was admitted to UC Davis as a chemical engineer, of all things. So I did that for about a year. And then I met some chemical engineers and realized that was not the career for me. I actually was involved in a student organization, and that's where I had the opportunity to meet some folks and decide, what I was really interested in was a professional path that allowed me to work with people. I ended up switching my career to psychology, and towards the end of my undergraduate career at Davis, I learned about the field of student affairs. So I worked in student housing as an undergraduate, enjoyed sort of the interpersonal piece, working with my peers, and learned that I could actually pursue that as a professional. And that's what brought me to University of the Pacific. So I received my master's from UOP in education administration with an emphasis in student affairs, had the opportunity to work as a hall director. And during that time is really where I cultivated my interest and passion around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Much like Michael, I worked at the CCI. I actually had the opportunity to work with Aaron as well, go figure. Did some work with the community outreach program, got to tour some of the high schools out in Stockton and really learn a lot about the community. I grew up in Vallejo, California, and actually saw a lot of parallels between some of the things that were happening in Stockton and my own experience growing up. And so that was really enlightening for me to have that opportunity to think about the community and the role of higher education in a community like Stockton, and really dedicated myself to that path moving forward, this idea of supporting diverse students. So that led me to a number of different roles in student affairs over the year. And previous to the role that I was in, I had the opportunity to actually step into some leadership roles at UC Davis, where I worked with our different employee resource groups. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as a number of our staff advocacy groups at Davis. And that's where I learned a lot more about human resources and specifically staff recruitment. And honestly, in terms of the HR field, there's a lot of things I probably wouldn't want to do, but certainly I enjoy the opportunity to do this work around diversity and diversifying our workforce. And so ultimately that opportunity to bring top talent to the university is what attracted me to the opportunity. And really this deep understanding that representation matters in the workforce, in particular as it pertains to supporting diverse students, diverse patients. They need to see representation. They need to see folks who look like them. And I have the opportunity to play a really crucial role in that. So that's what I'm doing now. I really enjoy it. And I'm excited to talk to this group more about the work we're doing here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. You both bring a unique perspective, and I think you were both very modest. You have a pretty impressive track record with your work. So thank you for introducing yourselves. I think the first question I'd like to ask is probably contextual around University of the Pacific and maybe the community we're in. But some people here at UOP, they might be struggling with where to start on, how they can grow personally, how they can make their own workplace more inclusive, and without sounding stupid or being afraid of saying the wrong thing. Any suggestions or guidance around that that you could help us and help our UOP community in getting started?
Michael, you want to go for it?
Yeah, I feel like between Lyndon and I, we probably have a huge entire list. So a couple things that really come to mind for me is really practicing inclusion. So inclusion is actually one of Netflix's core 8 values. And so at the end of the day, inclusion is one. What has been very successful, as Lyndon mentioned, we'll chat about it later, but ERGs. So ERGs are employee resource groups. I'm not sure if UOP has those today, but I definitely think they should for students, for faculty as well. I think if you could really, intersect faculty and students together, I think it could be really powerful for students and staff to really continue learning. I think of inclusion as hiring and promoting. If you're going to promote someone at UOP on the faculty side, inclusion better be one of the values and one of the reasons why you're promoting that person. Also with hiring, if you're looking to hire someone, are they an inclusive leader? Are they an inclusive faculty member? How do they think about inclusion? That really needs to be embedded into the promoting and hiring processes. So those are a couple just that come top to mind. I'll let Lyndon share a couple. Maybe we'll just bounce back and forth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I echo that sentiment completely. Really functionally, the best piece of advice that I give, our managers, our supervisors, folks, especially in leadership roles, around how to navigate these challenging but necessary conversations in the workplace is just listening. It's this idea of humility and understanding that nobody has all the answers, and that's okay. It's okay, to be in a position of influence, but not know how to step into these conversations, not feel like you have all the answers or that you can come up with the answers, because truly, if we had the answers, we'd be making progress. And right now we're seeing a lot of societal issues being brought to light, and we're seeing this perpetuation of injustices happening. And what it speaks to is a need to try something different. And in my mind, that key piece is creating space to just talk. And certainly, highlighting the voices of, if we're talking about racial workplace issues, people of color, underrepresented communities, folks in your workforce who don't see themselves represented, and hearing that. Because the alternative is you're talking about others, you're talking about communities, you're trying to create solutions without first empowering the voices that are being impacted by these situations the most. So my recommendation is to always start with that sense of humility, that openness to listen, to understand, and not immediately try to find solutions or try to throw resources at problems to make them go away. Just really sitting in that ambiguity and that discomfort, and understanding that for, people of color, and now especially that discomfort that you're feeling is what we're feeling every day.
Yeah, Dr. Wardell, she was a guest. She taught us about cultural humility, and it sounds like what you're talking about also is that sometimes we think that we have to be experts at something before we can have conversations. And even the idea of cultural competence, implies that you're going to be an expert at culture, which may not be possible. So cool. Yeah. Michael, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think another thing is just continuous research and education. As Lyndon mentioned, not one person knows everything. Also, one thing that I want to mention, anything that I do share today is based off of my own personal experience. I haven't studied, different things that I want to chat about, but really it's just from lived experiences. And so when you are having conversations, for example, with employee resource groups or folks of one demographic, and maybe you're an ally, I would really recommend going into that conversation to listen versus to take up space. That is really your time to listen, to learn what other communities are experiencing. The next is we have to use our lived experiences to impact others. And so I think two things that are important to me that I also want to share is my identity. So I identify as LGBTQ. I'm gay and I'm proud to be it. I wasn't proud to be it at UOP. I will say that. When I was a student, it was difficult for me to express my identity just because of the demographics at UOP. The next is I also identify as Latinx, Hispanic, and so those are two identities that are extremely underrepresented at UOP in the tech industry. And so I use my lived experience to try to impact others. And when I was younger, even now, I wish I could see folks of color that are also LGBTQ and really speaking, advocating, and trying to make an impact. And so I use my own lived experiences to make an impact for folks that may have my identities, but also just any folk who is underrepresented in tech. It's really our job to help others. And so sometimes it also just takes us to be bold, to push back, and to advocate as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I want to also really emphasize the importance of folks doing work, doing individual work, being self-reflective, thinking about their privilege, their identity, the space they take, and understanding that a lot of this work is really introspective. When we think about policies and we think about our practices and we think about the roles that we're in our organizations, it is equally important to really focus on challenging status quo in the things we're doing and really trying to identify areas where there are institutionalized issues. You know, there are many things that are built into our practices, our policies, whether it's hiring and recruiting, you know, areas that Michael and I focus in, or really anything else where there's these built-in biases that exclude underrepresented and marginalized communities. Mm. And until we dismantle those and make meaningful progress in that area, a lot of this stuff is just talk. So certainly holding space for communities that are impacted by current issues, but also doing that work to really look at structures, the institutions that we are in, and really try to focus on how we can do that meaningful work that isn't always sexy, but is really, really important in creating meaningful and substantive change.
So a question comes to mind for both of you when you start to address some of these systemic issues. How do you, or how have you identified what those are? And, you know, not to get too granular, but I would imagine you start looking at policies and, you know, structures in place that are just built to favor white folks. So how do you identify those areas?
I'll start off. Mine is going to focus specifically on talent and recruiting. So my job at Netflix is a recruiter, but what I do in my job is to create space for inclusion and diversity. So I consider myself a diversity recruiter. I'm also on a path that it's going to be very similar to Lyndon's current space right now, but just specifically on the tech side. And so anything that I'm really focused on is all on talent. How do I help folks that are underrepresented just get more opportunities at a company like Netflix? So for example, we have data that shows us right now that over half of folks who apply to Netflix are male. And so how do we create space for more folks who don't identify as male, whether maybe female, non-binary, et cetera, to apply to Netflix? And so it's actually us going outside and thinking creatively, where should our job postings be located at? What type of external outreach are we doing for different communities? And so for us, that's what we have to think about more on the talent side, is how do we create opportunities for folks who are underrepresented and folks that we know are not applying to Netflix today. So that's kind of what a lot of my focus is more on the talent side.
Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate that piece around data, you know, and again, certainly for those of you that are in leadership roles or folks that have that opportunity to look at your organization holistically, data can be a really compelling tool in order to identify trends, areas, or populations that are missing from your workforce or the clients you serve. And so while that's not the first thing I would go to, I certainly think that's an important piece to talk about is really just looking at the numbers and trying to identify strategies to address areas where you see gaps or inequities. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, a really important piece too, again, is just going back to that humility is just, you know, doing your homework, understanding that no organization is perfect as a baseline, and knowing that there are always ways that we can improve and do better. I'm a huge proponent of just, you know, listening to other people talk about these things and then really trying to make sense of them for myself and the work that I'm doing. You know, the work I do is grounded in learnings from so many different people, so many different perspectives. And the idea is you need to be open to that and find those pieces that you connect with and that resonate and that make sense for your organization. And then think about how to implement them in a way to create change. And sometimes it's big change and sometimes it's little things, but all of that is important in creating progress.
Thank you.
To add on,
go ahead, Michael.
As well as inclusion teams are important. When I started Netflix 3 years ago, Netflix didn't feel that we needed to build an inclusion team, didn't feel that we needed to invest in the talent team to support inclusion and diversity efforts. That is all, in my opinion, incorrect. You need to have an inclusion team. You need to have professionals in this space. You need to have professionals in the inclusion side on the talent as well. And actually, when I found out about Lyndon and I being on this webinar together, I thought it was an amazing coincidence, because I didn't even know a role like Lyndon's exists for higher education or for colleges, when I think it's imperative. I have a really good friend who works at UCSF for more of for a different space, but she's also in the space around helping them bring in diversity into the workforce and who they're bringing into their programs. And I'm not sure if UOP has that, but I think UOP needs that. You need to really bring in staff that are underrepresented. We hear often hire more folks of color. There is a reason why folks say hire more folks of color. It's not just folks of color, it's folks that are all underrepresented. That is the future. And if you really want to be able to connect with students or the faculty, if you don't have the employee population to be diverse, then that's number one on where an organization or company might need to really focus on first.
Absolutely. Diversity is net gain in your workplace. It's not box checking. It's not compliance driven. It's not a thing you do because you have to do it. Diversity brings value to everything. It brings creativity. It brings different perspective. Michael and I were talking a lot about Netflix current initiatives to bring more diversity to their workforce. And I think we're already seeing the implications of that. We're seeing new and different types of media and different narratives being heard because voices are being empowered and given the space to share and be heard. And certainly there's a business case for diversity. I live in HR, dollars and cents matter. And we see that organizations that have more diversity make more money. They have, higher satisfaction rate with the folks that they support and they serve. So, I'm driven by my heart, in my mind. Like, I care about this because I care about this. But certainly there are many other reasons why diversity is essential to the success of any organization, any university. And if you are not rethinking everything you do through that lens, you are doing a disservice to your organization. And that's really a charge to leaders to think about the way you are disadvantaging yourself by not being proactive and being leaders in these spaces.
Yeah. The leadership aspect of this is so important. I really feel that people at the highest level need to see this and understand this and possibly see that that's just not happening everywhere. And if you look around, you might not see a whole lot of diverse people in leadership roles. And that's, I think, part of the problem. So I have a question that I wrestle with, and I'm curious what you all think. Going off script a little bit, gentlemen. Sometimes people of color are asked to do the work and to educate other people who maybe are trying to learn about, equity and inclusion, diversity. And I have a personal feeling about it. I don't mind, if someone asks me to come talk to the team about a topic around these issues, I don't mind. But often I hear, that that's not our job. What are your thoughts around that?
I'll jump in with just a quick comment. I think my comment is I struggle with that too. Certainly, there is an emotional burden that underrepresented communities feel when they need to be the ones to not only navigate their own trauma, navigate their own emotions, their own feelings. We're living in the world of COVID-19 right now. That is just, an existential additional weight on everyone. And then to ask the same folks that are being marginalized and oppressed by these systems to then educate people in power, that doesn't always sit well with me. Michael and I are in unique roles in that, we have made the decision to step into these spaces formally. And I know for both of us, and I'm sure for Hector, you as well, our lived experiences inform why we care about this, the perspective we bring, and, and there is value there in being able to speak to what you've gone through as a way to, try to institutionalize meaningful change. But I am of the thought that everyone has a role and responsibility in this work. And it is not something that you can sit back and passively just wait to have happen to you. We all have a responsibility to be self-reflective, to look at the policies, to think about the privilege we have and how we benefit from that.
Right.
I have a doctoral degree from UC Davis and a master's degree, and I've been able to navigate these systems, but these systems were not designed for people who look like me. I have found a way through that, but I shouldn't have to make concessions my entire life to get something that will allow me to be the person I want to be. And so the mirror needs to be shined on these organizations in order to, do the work.
Yeah, thank you.
I agree with what Lyndon mentioned and with what you mentioned, Hector. So I have chosen, I actually had a talk with myself, I have pep talks myself all the time that I choose to be in this inclusion diversity space. I choose to be vulnerable, to try to make an impact, to show, what it's like being the only gay person on a team, what it's like being the only person of color on a team. It's not fun. And when there is diversity or inclusion or representation topics that get brought up, who do they ask or who do they look to in the room? The person that's underrepresented, the person of color. And so there is a tax that comes with being underrepresented. Some folks will want to dedicate themselves and want to have the conversations and want to make an impact. Some are just tired of it. And so we definitely have to acknowledge that. And so we shouldn't just tap one person in the room every time. If they come to us and say, hey, I want to help with this, great, but we shouldn't be the ones tapping them. I was actually on a panel a couple weeks ago that Sal Ramirez is on the line, that he helped to get me on the panel. And it was for Pride Month, and it was with an organization called Pequeria. And it was specifically a conversation around having identities that intersect. And so having the LGBTQ identity and having the Latinx identity that intersect, and what it really means to have these identities, and how have they impacted you in your career. And I said something that I stayed true to myself, is I use what may have once held me back to move me forward. Whether it's the first generation college student, I was part of the CIP program at University of the Pacific, which is the main reason on how I got to UP and how I was able to even graduate, because being part of that program. Maybe being gay, being the only person of color in a room, I use all of that to my advantage now. Before, I let the industry, I let society, I let companies made me think that I wasn't enough because of just this natural imposed imposter syndrome, when I just feel like I'm an imposter because I'm in a classroom with all white students. I feel like I'm an imposter because I'm in a room with the majority of folks. And that's just this natural imposter syndrome that I have, when I'm like, actually, like, no, I know I can work hard. I know I'm intelligent, but it's just because of what this environment looks like. And so now I use identities that I have to make an impact. And essentially it has actually helped me move forward in life. And so that's just the kind of way I look at it. But once again, not everyone looks at it that way. And so it's definitely a personal decision to get involved in inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, a lot of things going off in my head right now and in my heart. I can relate to the imposter syndrome. I remember sitting in class in the doctoral program thinking I'm the only person of color in here. And, I didn't feel like I fit in. And yet I probably was one of the smarter people in the classroom, so it's almost baked into our consciousness. Lyndon, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, just to your point, I'm sure you were the smartest person in the classroom, so don't sell yourself short. I think where I experienced some dissonance too, speaking to that imposter syndrome piece, is when you are trying to reframe what is defined as the status quo, you can feel lost sometimes when everything you're hearing is like, there's a particular way to measure success. There are particular markers, in the recruitment world around who is an ideal candidate. When you're saying, this is not right, this status quo is discriminatory and exclusionary and biased, but everything about the institution or the work that you're doing is built in a particular way, that's hard, to have the confidence to say, no, this isn't right. I know this is what everyone says is right, but it's not. Because if you look around and you look at the impact of the way we recruit or the way we do business, we don't see the diversity represented that we know is out there. So that is what I fall back on, is this understanding that even if I feel like my voice is small or I'm receiving pushback, I fall back on the fact that I know what I see is not the way things should be. And that is what encourages me to keep going. And then the other piece I just want to touch on really briefly is also this idea of intersectional identities. So certainly when I do diversity trainings, I talk a lot about the ways in which we all are privileged in some ways and then marginalized in other ways. You know, I use an example of myself as a male of color. I have lots of privilege as somebody who identifies as a male. I've benefited in many ways from that identity. And then I've, you know, also been followed in a store because I'm a Black man. So, you know, there are times that I am certainly very privileged, and there are times that this intersection of my identity has felt me feel marginalized. And so as you think about allyship and you think about why you care about this topic, you know, lean into those different identities that you have and think about what it's felt like when somebody has stood up for something or stood up for an aspect of your identity, and how that felt as you think about allyship and your role in supporting others in communities that you may not be a part of.
One other thing that I also want to mention, I've been seeing this, I think LinkedIn is a very powerful tool. I connect with folks all the time. I save articles that I don't have the time to read now, but I want to read in the future. But the reason why I say this, I've seen this idea of pay your workforce. And so I have seen a lot of folks of color or from underrepresented groups being tapped on to answer all these questions, host a training, can you host this conversation? And I actually think if you're going to tap on those folks, you should pay those folks as well. So pay them for that. If you're asking them to do your diversity or inclusion work and they're not in an official diversity or inclusion role, you should pay them, figure out some way to compensate them, add it into a promotion cycle, etc. But make sure that they're also being rewarded for the work that they're doing.
Yeah,
I love that idea.
I have a colleague who reminded me that, you know, just because you are part of a community doesn't mean you have an obligation to do the labor. And if you're doing the labor, you know, you should be compensated for it, certainly.
Yeah, you know, and it's been a struggle of mine, and I've decided to lean in and to push in. My role as an ombuds is pretty unique in that I'm supposed to be neutral, like impartial. And I think that's impossible right now around certain issues. And so my choice is to do as much as I can and do as much heavy lifting as I can. And yet I know there are a lot of people at Pacific EOP that have work to do and they want to do the work. They just don't always know where to start. And I think there's a lot of passion right now and energy around this conversation. And, you know, I was checking out your websites, and it's amazing how many resources you all have around DEI and inclusion. So I don't want to run out of time, but I wanted to ask about employer resource groups because I think it fits in right now. How do they work? Have they been effective? Are they different from affinity groups? So can you provide some perspective on that? We're starting that conversation at Pacific now.
Michael, do you want to hop in there first?
Yeah, of course. So my experience with employee resource groups, ERGs, is from my own experience. I'm in various ERGs now at Netflix. I also was part of them at Uber. In the tech industry, every company has them today. If they may not have an ERG because they may have small demographics of their employee population. So what then I've seen is companies will then create, instead of having maybe a Black focused ERG or a Latinx focused ERG or a woman focused ERG, they're actually creating more general spaces. So folks of color ERGs, if they feel like they might have a large population for both. I think ERGs are extremely important, so they should be there. Employee resource groups exist for groups to form communities, to be able to identify resources for retention of those communities, to identify opportunities to better recruit folks from that community. At Netflix, we have 14 different ERGs. We have 50 chapters across our entire workforce. We have about 3,400 employees part of ERGs, and we just have about like 7,200 employees. So definitely over half of our employees are part of ERGs. I am part of our Latinx ERG, and I'm also part of our Pride ERG at Netflix. I don't have enough time to be equally part of both. And so I have chosen to be part of the Latinx ERG, and I actually lead our Bay Area chapter. And so ERGs are important at Netflix. It's a huge initiative. We've actually invested in them over time. Now we actually have a solely program manager dedicated to organizing and helping support our ERGs with resources. One thing that I want to mention is ERGs are employee-led and ran. So it's employees that are running these ERGs. They're devoting their own time that does take away from their actual day job, but they're part of these ERGs where they get to make an impact for this community, but also for the entire company at Netflix. And so Netflix really, really believes in employee resource groups, and ERGs are really doing a lot of the work at the inclusion level. They're just getting the support and resources of the company.
Thank you.
Yeah, well said. At Davis, we have, I think 14 or so between the two campuses. And I think the other piece that I'll add is employee resource groups is an opportunity to really advocate and leverage staff voices and amplify staff voices to ensure that, underrepresented staff communities are heard and have power. Again, our workplaces are not designed for folks in the minority. Make sense of that how you will in your workplace. And so these groups allow people to coalesce, to talk about campus climate issues, to talk about representation or lack of a representation, to put on programmatic initiatives in order to ensure that, their perspective and their values are heard and seen. And there are a lot of opportunities for allyship as well. So at Davis, we have a model where all of our employee resource groups come together under a broader staff advocacy organization. And that's an incredibly powerful group. When you have employee resource group leaders from the African-American community, the veteran community, the Latinx community, the Asian community, folks can find common ground and really think about how to leverage that power to create meaningful change. This particular group, talks to our chancellor every year, talks to our provost, talks to HR leaders, brings folks to the table to have meaningful conversations. And so what ERGs do ultimately is create space for people to come together in a formal way and create that sense of belonging and that sense of community that is essential to any employee, but particularly employees who don't see people who look like themselves in their workplace.
Great, thank you. That's so helpful. Time is just flying by. It's almost quarter till. I wanted to give participants an opportunity to ask questions. There's one in the chat right now. I'm going to read it to you, and then maybe we can see if we have any other questions. This is from Alisa Magorian, she, her. Some of the research on campus racial climate for staff highlights the impact of microclimates within specific departments and how the departmental level climate influences diverse staff perceptions of belonging. A critical piece of departmental microclimates are the supervisors / leadership in that area. And yet, because of system inequities in many departments, the leaders are primarily white, male, hetero. Question: what practices and policies can we implement to hire more leader supervisors of color? How can we help current supervisors to learn and care about diversity, equity, and inclusion? So it's a leadership question. Good question.
I'll answer this briefly, and then Lyndon probably could expand more than I could. But once again, I think I'm not sure if UOP has a space or team like Lyndon's today, but I think it's very, very important. You need to invest in the talent recruiting team for UOP. Who is doing the hiring, and whoever is doing the hiring, they definitely need some resources there. It's part of my job as a recruiter to be able to discover and identify folks that are underrepresented. So how am I doing that? I'm looking on LinkedIn. I'm planning and attending networking events, and I'm trying to recruit folks now, but I'm also trying to maybe build relationships with folks that maybe I'm going to recruit in 2 years when their contract at UC Davis is done, and et cetera. And so we need to think about hiring now and really investing in your talent team, but hiring now, but also hiring for the future. The next is, I think ERGs are extremely important. The next is at Netflix, we have an executive ally that is attached to every employee resource group. So vice president across the entire company, because we are very, very aware that folks in leadership positions probably don't have the most diverse network. If so, they have opportunity to still diversify and learn more. And so we're actually helping our leaders at Netflix get exposed to different communities than they're a part of by actually helping them pair with an ERG. And so they are actually partnering with this ERG throughout their course working at Netflix. And so that's just broadening this leader's perspective. That's just one way, but it's a lot of investments definitely are needed to help make this possible. Lyndon, I'll pass it over to you.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, Alyssa, first of all, thank you. That was a great question. And, I think if the three of us could answer that, we'd probably write a book, and sell you the book. It's a big and challenging question. And so I think the piece that I'll just talk a little bit about is looking at homegrown talent as well. I have this really interesting dashboard that I use when I look at the workforce at UC Davis and across UC. At UC Davis, we have, I don't know what good diversity looks like in terms of a workforce, but you see a decent amount of representation if you just look at us in the aggregate. But as you start to disaggregate representation by the types of roles people have, whether they're more entry-level roles, middle management positions, senior leadership roles, or top of the top, as you move up, we see the representation become more and more, to your point, we become more male-dominated as you move up, and we become much more white as you move up. And so if that is where we are now, we can talk about outreach and community partnerships and attracting talent, but we need to look at why our pipeline and why our upward trajectory for employees is leading to a lack of representation over time. So I think a lot about, really equity-minded training and development opportunities. I think a lot about, again, employee resource groups as spaces to talk about professional development. And when you're offering professional development, thinking about communities of color and underrepresented communities and the unique needs of these curriculums. Because again, if we just continue to deliver the same type of training and development that we've always done, we're going to continue to see the same patterns persist. And then I think just as importantly is naming these things, not beating around the bush. The reason I show that dashboard is to say, look, we don't see diversity represented at the top of our leadership chain. Like, it just is what it is. The data says this. Let's name it as a starting point and work from there. And oftentimes that shakes people and it's uncomfortable to talk about that. But we need to look at that specifically if we can then work backwards and think about the policies, practices, and biases that are built into our internal talent pipeline that are leading to these disparities.
I also wanted to throw in I firmly believe inclusion should be part of hiring. You should be assessing a candidate if they are going to be an inclusive colleague, an inclusive leader, inclusive student. And also same thing with promoting. If someone is not, I don't think somebody should be promoted if they're not inclusive. And I think folks, this is what I do. So I'm speaking from experience. I'm going to call it right out in front of you that was excluding, that was not inclusive, that was a word you shouldn't have used, that was a microaggression. And I do know it is a little, scary. There are a lot of feelings that come to mind around calling it out. But if you don't call it out, I essentially it's tolerating it. But again, if you don't call it out, there could be, maybe there isn't trust there. Maybe it's not an inclusive environment with those other. And so that's a whole nother problem to tackle. But I definitely think you need to call it out and have inclusion part of rehiring processes.
Awesome. There's another question from Sal Ramirez. The Black Lives Matter movement prompted companies to speak up and publicly support diversity. How can we as employees hold our leadership accountable for following through with actionable steps?
Here, I'll do the quick answer this time, Michael, and I'll let you kind of dive in a little bit deeper if you want to. The first thing that comes to mind when I saw that question was around just organizing, and demanding a seat at the table when these decisions are being made. Again, going back to the employee resource groups, that's one of the most powerful pieces that they bring is this collective voice and this positionality as an organized unit that is asking for the change and the representation that we need to see. And so I'm very fortunate in my role to be able to be at some of those tables, not at all of the tables. But when I'm not, I'm also thinking strategically about the players and the levers that need to be pulled in order to have that person, take the steps they need to take. I understand that every leader is different. Some folks are driven by data. Some folks are driven by money. Some folks are driven by their heart. And it's really being a strategic thinker and identifying those strategies that we can use in order to create change, when we're not at the table, but always asking and ensuring that we have that space to participate.
Yeah, and I can't help but jump in here. I think often people of color aren't at the table and they're not invited to the table. So they find other ways to speak up. And I think that takes courage. It takes some courage because, you know, people might not like you for it. And I think now more than ever, there's this opportunity to speak up. And people are paying more attention. But anyway, I don't want to skip over Rosa's. Rosa Munoz has a question. How do you authentically provide that effort of recruiting diverse populations without seeming like it's just checking a box to have a certain amount of a specific group? As an employee, when I hear about recruitment efforts of these groups, I appreciate that there's action, but wonder if it's authentic.
I'll start off. It's hi Rosa, by the way. But no, it's a good question. It's something I have to ask myself every time I start on a new search. So my role as a recruiter is I partner with the hiring manager if you're hiring a hire for your team. About 2 years ago, I'd get the question, I want to hire a woman, I want to hire a Black person, I want to hire a Latin person. And I focus on those three groups because those three groups are the most underrepresented in tech. And so if I've mentioned anything, that's why. But it's also what Netflix mostly, what they've typically asked in terms of hiring. And so the question is why? Why do you want to hire a woman? Why do you want to hire a Black person? Why do you want to hire? I know the why, I hope to know the why, but I want to hear that hiring partner, hiring manager articulate why. What's going to be the impact? Tell me why they want this perspective on the team versus just to check the box. Once I hear a clear articulation of why and understand the importance of it, it's actually going to help me as your recruiting partner really become more motivated to help you make this effort and make this goal. And the next is I believe in additive hiring. And so if you look at a team today, if I was hiring for my team, what I would expect of myself is I want to take a full assessment of my team today. Who is on my team? The tenure, how long they've been at the company, the companies they came from before, their cultures, their perspectives, identities they possess. I want to understand who my team is today. And then I want to understand what is missing for my team. What perspectives are missing? What may be the only one perspective of my team and how do I add on to there? And so I think of the idea of adding on to a team versus I need to hire something just to check the box. When you think about diversity, you want to have the most diverse team possible because that's how your team is going to make the most impact. That's how your team is going to grow. And so when I think about hiring for diversity or adding on to a team, it's adding on what is missing from your team. That's how you should think about hiring, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Great. I guess the piece I'll just add again is reiterating the importance of looking at data, you know, taking all the stuff you're doing, all the outreach efforts, all the trainings, all the initiatives, all the great branding and the flowery words that we use when we talk about this stuff, in figuring out how you can measure it. Data is not everything, but it is an important and often underutilized way of thinking about this work. It can feel very depersonal, but you can really functionally identify some areas where there can be improvement. Data is also hard to come by. You know, I work for a giant public university and I have a really hard time getting the data I need to really do this work. But one of the ways we're thinking about that is really understanding our employment pipeline. So we're looking at the diversity of our applicant pools. You know, we do tons of outreach, ton of community partnership. We attract the talent, but we also need to look again at who we're routing forward. You know, we can have a really diverse pool, but if we're not seeing that diversity persist through the screening process, maybe there's something wrong with our screening. Maybe our job descriptions all require a bachelor's and a master's, and we know that immediately that eliminates populations that haven't had equitable access to education. Maybe we're asking for 10 years of experience for an entry-level role. You know, you see that all the time. And then we need to look at who we're hiring, you know, and that's the hardest conversation to have. If we see diversity persisting through our recruitment efforts, but we are not hiring those qualified, talented, diverse candidates, that's a big issue. And that's a hard issue to talk about. In particular, in public education, you know, we don't make decisions based on people's identity, but we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that we are giving everyone a fair chance to persist through that process. So that's where I try to have those really hard conversations to understand why, if we're doing the outreach, if we're working on our job descriptions, our workforce is not reflective of that. That's bias. That is attitudes that need to change to see the value of diversity, to Michael's point, as value add to the work environment.
Thank you. That's awesome. So we're right up about 5 minutes to the hour. I don't see any other questions. Let's see. There is a comment. Thank you for your thoughtful insights on belonging in the workplace. I'm excited to hear about efforts to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion at UOP. All right, here's a question. Maybe we have time for this last one. As a Latina student, I wanted to know what sort of advice would you give to students of color studying majors that are typically white and male dominated, such as STEM majors? That's a good question.
Gosh, I don't know. I was in engineering and then I left. So I'm the best person to answer that question. I'll just say it's important to continue to ask why these spaces are white and male dominated in whatever capacity you can. Continuing to highlight that and message that and not concede who you are as part of that process, because you are bringing a new and unique perspective to STEM, and to not lose sight of that and know that that's valuable and meaningful in this work.
I'll take that question to heart. For one, I want to just say, being someone who identifies as female and Latinx, so a Latina engineer is very underrepresented in tech. And so just stay on a good path and make sure that you're getting yourself there, because I'm excited for the future impact you'll make. There are so many organizations. There's SHIP, Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. I'm not sure if UOP has a chapter, but there's a national chapter that you can get involved with. Society of Women Engineers, there's chapters you can get involved with as well. I do know there is a Latinx focused professional fraternity at UOP. I would recommend getting involved with that. For one, there's also an organization called Tequeria. Sal is on the line. We're both part of that. That's an organization for professionals and for students. My god sister, she goes to USF, and she actually came with me to a networking event, and she got an internship because she networked through it. So there are a lot of organizations that exist with the power of Google. Literally, if you type in Google and just whatever you're looking for, there's a handful of resources to exist. Really start trying to find a mentor now. But I would be careful with this idea of a mentor. I think a good mentorship is a mentee, being able to impact that mentor, and that mentor being able to impact that mentee, not it being a one-sided relationship. A lot of professionals have a lot going on today. And so just something that I always want to remind students is like, hey, like, what is your value going to be to that mentor as well? But once again, there are a handful of resources that exist, and I would recommend just getting a few mentors. It's going to mentor you throughout college and help you get into the workforce.
Awesome.
Yeah, network is a big piece. It can feel very lonely, but just knowing that other people are going through the similar struggles that you're going through, and reaching out. You'd be surprised how willing people are to offer advice, make a connection, and support you in your journey.
We have 2 minutes, but I have to throw this in. Often people of color, they don't ask. They don't ask for the resources that are out there. And it just, I think it goes back to the way we are raised, imposter syndrome, et cetera, and not feeling like we have a right to ask. So you're worthy is what I would say. You deserve it. You deserve all the support you can get. Thank you, Michael and Lyndon. I so appreciate our talk. I feel like I've gotten to know you too also, and I feel a kindred spirit with you. And I just wanted to just extend appreciation for your time and your wisdom and everything you shared. And again, thank you, Alumni Relations, for hosting this and for allowing me to be a part of this. It is almost 1 o'clock. I'm not sure if Chris, you want to jump back in here or if we're done, but thanks again for the opportunity to host this.
Yeah.
This
all
session.
right. Well, let me say on behalf of Pacific Alumni Relations, thank you for all three of you. Hector, for doing a great job hosting, doing the work that you're doing as our Pacific Ombudsman. Michael, thank you so much for giving your time and your talent and doing the work that you're doing at your space. And Lyndon, the same. Thank you so much for coming back and letting us know with everything that you have studied and everything that you've lived through, and all three of you, your experiences, your knowledge. Thank you for sharing and giving back to the university. We appreciate it so much. On behalf of Kelly Page, our Associate Vice President, she says thank you to each one of you individually. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I think one of the first steps is, as was mentioned by our panelists, is listening. And so joining these types of webinars and just sitting and listening is a wonderful first step. And it's great to see Pacific alumni and students and staff here on these webinars looking to increase their own knowledge. So thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful day. We will have this recording up on pacificalumni.org/Tigers Together. So if you want to come back and reference any of that, and thank you again so much. Have a wonderful day, all.
Yeah, go find us on LinkedIn. We're waiting for you.
I'm going to look you both up. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Bye, everyone. Good meeting. Take care.
Great.
Excellent.